Elden Ring Nightreign is a game that presents many unique challenges, even amongst From Software's lineup, but today I'm going to show you the ultimate guide of everything you need to know about Nightreign. This video is meant to both teach you the basics and have an understanding of the structure and approach you need for the game, but also we're going to give you more advanced tips as the video goes on to make you a very effective team player or an absolute menace in solo if you want to just take on Night Lords by yourself. This video is going to show you how to do both, and I promise you will be very effective at this game by the time you're done with this. I've heard a lot of people saying recently that solo is not a viable way to play in this game, and while I do understand people's problems with this, I don't really agree at all. The more I've been playing this, the more I actually feel that it's actually in a decent spot for solo. At the time of me recording this, the patch has not come out yet, but From Software did announce that they will be making changes next week to make solo a little bit easier, mostly in the form of more rune acquisition. So if you're watching this right now, then solo is going to be a little bit harder than it will be maybe in the very near future, but either way, you can still play multiplayer or you can play by yourself and do just fine. At this point, I've soloed almost every single one of the Night Lords, so I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on this game at the moment, and I'm going to share with you what I've learned. So let's start simple. What exactly is Nightreign? It's a little bit different than the base game of Elden Ring, where this is more centered around trying to get to a boss after a couple of nights, and you need to survive 3 nights to face off against a Night Lord. As soon as you land in this game, your goal is going to be to kill enemies, gather runes, get weapons, and eventually survive the night. At the end of each night, there will be this ring of fire that comes in and constricts the play area that you need to get into inside of a safe zone, and once you get there, eventually you're going to fight off against a boss. So you'll have a couple of these throughout your game, and if you defeat 2 of them successfully on day 1 and 2, you'll be given night 3, which will take you to this gate and eventually face off against a Night Lord. So your only real objective is to survive the night and get as strong as you can. So that sounds easy, but how do you go about doing that? Well, first of all, you'll need to select your character, which you can pick from a total of 8, and don't worry if you're starting the game and don't have access to all of them yet. There will be a couple of characters that you'll unlock a little bit later in the game once you've obtained some items, and then you explore the round table hold a little bit. But this is going to be your safe hub and essentially where you prepare for the next expedition. From here, there's a couple of things you can do to bolster your character. The most important thing is relics. You can see this table, and interacting with it will let you pick different relics, these stones, and build your character to your playstyle. Now, here's the thing. There are a lot of different relics in the game that you'll get through random expeditions, but easily the best one for each character are the ones that you obtain by doing their quest story remembrances. Now, these will be, again, accessed as you play the game a little bit more, so if you don't have them right away, don't sweat it. Your only goal should be to obtain as many of these as you can by continuously doing expeditions, getting as far as you can, and coming back with the relics that you do obtain. But this is essentially how to buff and customize your character from the perspective of their attributes. Now, the question you might be having is, what character is for me and which one do I pick? Well, that's totally up to you, but a couple of things to consider is that Wilder is probably the best beginner character for a lot of reasons, and I especially recommend him in solo. As you get more confident with the mechanics of the game, then I would recommend going and exploring different characters and such, and after you unlock more, perhaps adjusting your playstyle. But all of the characters have not only different passive traits, but they also have different scalings. Now, this is important because this will determine essentially how much damage your weapons do and what kinds of weapons you want to go after. So to keep it very simple, something like Wilder or Raider are very strength-oriented, meaning like great swords or axes and big melee weapons of that nature are going to do better for them, where even like Duchess or Recluse or something like that, anything with a high faith or intelligence is going to be more, spell or sorcery based. And while I recommend playing at least 5 or 6 matches with the same character to get a feel for them and an understanding of their abilities, feel free to change at any time over here in the roundtable hold. There will be a knight, and you can swap characters at any moment if you want to go for a different playstyle. And there's certain characters that are more effective against certain Night Lords, but really you can play whoever you want mostly at the end of the day. But your first expedition is going to be against Gladius, and this is the 3-headed dog that you see here. Now, everyone is going to start with this boss, but to get here, I'm going to show you kind of the basics of Limveld and how to have an optimized run, whether you're playing co-op or solo. The world might feel a little bit overwhelming at first, but a lot of this game is determining what is worthy to spend your time on and what is not, because ultimately this game is about time management and efficiency. So if you can kill bosses and other enemies very rapidly, you're going to get better as you go on. That's kind of just a fact of it. So just play a couple of games and try to work on your efficiency. But to give you a little bit of an introduction to the world, Limveld is easily traversable. There's no fall damage. You can sprint. You can use these spirit streams to go fast distances, whether up or, just trying to go forward. These are very good for getting around. This might sound like a silly tip, but honestly, just get comfortable with moving around because you're going to be doing it a lot in this game, and that's kind of what it's all about. So once you spawn in Limveld, you're going to have a site of grace near you, and then you're always going to have some kind of small encampment or little group of enemies to kill. This is very important because going from level 1 to 2 basically doubles all of your stats. So spend the moment your feet touch the ground, spend the next minute or so trying to kill all the enemies in this area, and then immediately go to the site of grace to level up to 2. Once you've done that, you can kind of start expanding out a little bit and picking and choosing what you go for. Now, there are a couple of options from this point. You can either go for these dungeons, you can go for caves, you can go for these churches, or you can go for encampments. If you're still early in the game, I'm going to recommend that you go after these churches because they typically have fairly easy bosses. Either you'll walk into one of these churches and you're going to have a golem, which you can very easily dispatch, or if there's a hole in the floor here, you can just drop down through and then inside of this dungeon will be a boss waiting for you. It's pretty much always in these two different configurations, right? And you're going to get some kind of like magic rewards and also a bunch of runes for beating this boss. I would make that your priority, but the other enemies aren't worthless. Killing these smaller enemies is actually important for picking up a small amount of runes, which can be the difference between 1 or 2 levels, so I would definitely do it. In the early game, when you're only level 2 or 3, I would stay away from things like encampments because you're not quite strong enough for them just yet. I mean, you can do it if you want to, but it's not advised. I would also stay far away from things like field bosses. It might be very enticing to try to kill that tree sentinel that's right next to your initial site of grace, but I promise you, if you're a low level, it's not worth your time. We can come back later. Focus on these ruins, focus on these churches. Matter of fact, the ruins not only have a boss that you can get for rewards, but keep on a lookout for an illusory floor, which leads to an additional cave full of rewards. So these are also very easy to farm in the early game. I would make these things your priority, and I would try to go to at least one fortress. These can usually be accessed from an underground door, and then once you kind of go through and up, once you get the reward of this area, you'll typically be given a stone sword key, which if you're playing solo, definitely keep in the early game, but if you're playing co-op, make sure at least one person has it because they are very crucial to having an optimized run. But get yourself a stone sword key very early on, and maybe let's say you're around level 3 or 4 right now, your first night still hasn't hit yet. You want to finish as many of these little objectives as possible and try to get to level 5 before you get the message that says the night is closing in. Now, before we talk about what to do on your first night, we need to talk about the weapons and abilities that you should be picking up. If you're playing solo, this is a little bit easier because you don't need to coordinate with other people on your team to make sure their builds are optimized. But let's start from a solo perspective where you're killing some of these bosses and then you get this reward and you get given an option of what to pick. Ideally, you want to pick better weapons. Here, the thing though to consider with weapons is that it's not like normal Elden Ring where it's just whatever's in your hand takes effect. There are weapons with passive abilities that as long as they're in your inventory, they are active. So you want to be in the habit of picking up weapons off the ground and, stacking passive abilities that are relevant and unique to you. However, there are a couple of passive abilities that only are in effect if you are holding the weapon, and that can be seen by this hand icon. So just look out for that here. Sometimes those are good, but most of the time, these passive abilities are just going on at all times. So stack up on weapons, but you want your primary weapon to be ideally what is dealing the most damage and or has a good status effect. In the case of solo, if you're playing Wilder, for example, if you come across a greatsword that has a passive bleed buildup and does holy damage, that's probably a pretty good weapon. And it's also worth considering that the rarity of your weapon does matter, but honestly, a weapon with better status effects is probably a better choice than a higher rarity weapon that isn't as relevant for your build. And again, as long as they have good passive effects, it's worth hanging on to them even if you never use them at all, if they're just in your inventory. Now, speaking of weapons, weapons and elemental damage, when it comes to the Night Lord you selected, you can see their elemental weakness that is shown by this icon right next to them. And for example, the three-headed starting boss is weak to holy, so any kind of weapon that deals holy damage that you can see up here in your status effects is going to be significantly more effective. You'll deal more damage and have more opportunities to stagger the boss. So if you're playing solo, definitely have whatever weapon is coordinate to the boss's weakness, as it will make a massive difference. In co-op, if every single one of your teammates has that status effect, it's pretty easy to shut that boss down pretty quickly, but ideally, not everybody's going to have it just in a realistic run, maybe only one or two. But either way, that's something you should strive for. So once you kind of understand the basics of weapons and getting better ones, now we can move on to your first night. What's going to happen is eventually the circle will close in, and you're going to have this white safe zone, and inside of this is going to be first a small group of enemies that spawn, and these are somewhat randomized depending on the Night Lord you're going after, so just keep that in mind. If you're playing the same boss over and over again, you're going to get the same mini bosses again and again. But you just need to work on killing and defeating all of these things. You'll fight off against your main boss of that night, and if you successfully defeat them, then the knight will leave, the actual ring of fire will go away, and you'll have access to the map once again. After you've defeated your first night boss, this is where I like to start planning my route for getting these different churches of America. So these are very important other activities besides going and farming, dungeons and ruins and things like that. You want to be going after these churches because these replenish your flask tiers, and they're typically pretty spread out across the map. So you can either do it after your first night or sometimes from the beginning of the game, planning your route to get as many of these churches as possible, because these will give you extra healing charges. That is insanely important, especially in solo. In addition to that, what you do immediately after the first night might be the most crucial aspects to the game, and what I like to do besides going after the churches of America is also start dealing with field bosses and using Everjails with my Stone Sword key that I got. Sometimes you won't have a key, but if you do, you can go up to these Everjails to spawn in a boss, and if you can quickly dispatch them, go ahead and do it, because you'll get a ton of runes and great rewards that puts you even farther ahead of the curve. And at this point as well, assuming you're leveled up to around 7, 8, or maybe even 9, now is when you can start dealing with these field bosses, which are shown by this red skull icon on the map. These can be almost anything at any time, so just be mindful of maybe what you're familiar with killing or what seems easy for you or even your build, but dealing with field bosses is a great way to farm lots of runes and great rewards. Killing as many field bosses as quickly as you can is honestly the key to getting like late game level and setup, and after maybe killing 1 or 2 of these, you should be around level 9 or 10, maybe even 11 if you can manage it, and if so, that's great. Other than if you're trying to get a specific elemental weapon type to deal with the boss, you can pretty much start ignoring these encampments or dungeons or ruins or whatever they are. Once you're in the second day, these kind of become irrelevant, or you can kill them if they're along the way, but I would definitely spend your time focusing on the field bosses, because they're going to net you much better rewards and far better runes. Anyways, the same thing from the first day is eventually going to happen on the second day, where you're going to get a warning saying that the night begins to close in, and same thing, it's going to push you towards a safe white tree at some point in the map. Now here's a little tip I do recommend. Throughout your entire journey, I recommend doing the outermost portions of the map first. As the game goes on, think about working your way in instead of out, because if you start on the outermost portions of the map, as the circle begins to close, you're going to have more time to do small little things or kill little groups of enemies along the way while you're running inside the center, if that makes sense. Save all the stuff in the middle for the last minute possible, because that's when you'll have the most amount of time to deal with that stuff. Do all of the most important outermost edge stuff first, which is typically the churches of America and or field bosses, and once you've done that, the circle will inevitably begin to close in again, but this is your last chance to do anything remaining that you want to get done before you get trapped once more. So this is your last call to do any dungeons or try to get any rewards before the final finale. So to prepare for your second night, here's where a couple of interesting tips come in. First of all, you want to understand what items work and which ones are worth taking. Now, obviously, most of them are pretty self-explanatory, or you probably know what they do if you've played Elden Ring at all, but some of the best things to have in Nightreign specifically, and definitely if you're playing solo, are a few key things. Firstly are warming stones. These are stones that you can place on the ground that give off a radius of healing, and this is either for you or your teammates, and this is essentially your only other real way to heal if you don't have more flasks. So these are worth keeping around. Another thing that's great is Exalted Flesh. This boosts your physical damage output, which is really nice. I really enjoy having these. You can never go wrong with them, and the boiled prawn or crab will reduce the damage you take momentarily, so that's also just a really good all-around one to have as well. A lot of the items you're going to come across are a bit situational. So, for example, some of these bulbuses are like, resistant to certain status effects and whatnot. You don't always need those at any given time, but perhaps the most important item you can have on your person, only if you're playing solo, are these Wending Graces. You can buy one of these from a merchant, or you can buy one just before you go and fight the Night Lord, and very rarely you can get them as a reward for killing a boss, but hang on to these because these are self-revives for your game, and these are only effective if you're playing solo, but they're definitely the best thing in the game by far. You might notice that there's a space in between your weapon equipment and your items at the bottom, and these two are for your talismans. Now, killing any scarabs in the game will give you a talisman, and you can even get them by clearing castles and finding them out of chests. But really, the more efficient way to do is to kill scarabs, and you can do this pretty easily, and you'll get given a couple of different talismans. These will provide solid buffs. You don't necessarily always need to have them for every single game. I've played plenty of matches without any talismans at all, but if you see a scarab, it's definitely worth going out of your way to kill these to get their rewards. As the circle begins to close in on your second night, you really want to focus on killing as many physical enemies as possible. Like, optimize every second to gather as many runes as possible to level up as many times as you can. If you're playing really efficient, you can actually be around level 10 or maybe even 11 or even 12 if you kill enough field bosses, but 10 is going to be plenty fine for just dealing with the second night. Once again, Limveld is set up to be very traversable, and it's not like Elden Ring where if you hit a wall, you're kind of just screwed. Like, you can jump over these, again, use these spirit streams to go high and far. Like, these are probably your best friend in terms of transportation. So really try to optimize every second you have before you need to get to the safe zone, because the efficiency will repay you in the end. But eventually, the circle is going to constrict once more, and you're going to have a second wave of nighttime enemies. These are going to be by far the toughest you face so far. You'll have your initial wave of a smaller group, and then you'll have your last major big boss. Now, sometimes you can get really unlucky and have, a damage type that doesn't really affect the boss at all, and those runs can kind of suck, or you can get extremely lucky and have the exact vulnerability to the main boss you're fighting. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. There is a little bit of RNG to this game. To some degree, your runs are going to be randomized, and that's kind of just how it goes. Tips for dealing with the second nighttime boss: it's obviously a bit situational depending on who you get, but another thing is that your character's general abilities can work together. If you're playing co-op, you can use things in tandem with one another to bolster the effects of the other. But if you're playing solo, I really like Wilder's ultimate because it does a lot of damage and a ton of stance, leading to potential breaks very often. And I like to pop mine pretty much in the beginning so I can spend the rest of the boss fight trying to get it back and maybe use it a second time. This is a very effective way to just output a lot of guaranteed damage and get critical hits, because another thing is that this ultimate, or rather all of the ultimates in the game, have a period of invulnerability, so you can use them during a giant attack from the boss or just simply use it to stagger them. Now, I also want to clear up some questions a couple people had about bosses. It's not just objectively better playing co-op, because the thing you have to consider is that boss health scales per player, meaning in solo, you're going to be ideally doing more damage per player than, against a 3-player scaled boss. Now, obviously, you can have 3 people and still deal with bosses quite effectively, but their health is going to be 3 times higher. A slightly more advanced tip is that, in my opinion, it's worth offhanding a second weapon that has a status effect buildup, so something like Scarlet Rot or maybe even Poison. Put that in your other hand, and you can try to proc it on the boss, because all of these status effects in this game scale with Arcane, where a lot of them do not in the base game of Elden Ring, including Scarlet Rot, which is an exceptionally good status effect in this game to have on a weapon. That will, to some degree, depend on your character's ability of Arcane. Like, the Executioner is particularly good at proccing status effects. It's kind of what they're for, but even if you just have any other enemy, you can still reliably do this. If you manage to defeat the second night boss, then you will no longer have access to Limveld. All that's left is to pick up your reward and then go to the Spirit Shelter. And upon arriving here, there's going to be this smithing table that you can use to upgrade your weapons if you want, and there's also also going to be a merchant, and if you're playing solo, I recommend the first thing you do in here is buy your Wending Grace before you level up. Make sure you get one of these if you're playing by yourself. If you're playing co-op, these will not be available for you, but this is your last chance to stock up before the Night Lord fight, and then you can also come over here to this grace to use your last bit of runes you got from that second night to finally level up again. If at this point you're sitting anywhere from level 10 to 12, then you're in good shape and you're fully prepared for this boss fight. Ideally, you want to be 11 or 12. That's probably the best case scenario, but either way, you're going to walk up to this door and then you're going to enter the Night Lord boss fight. At this point, it's really dependent on the Night Lord that you choose to face itself, but I'm just going to show you Gladius here. There's plenty of other ones that have different gimmicks, different movesets, and so on, and you're either going to win or lose here. If you die, you're still going to get some relics to bring back to the round table hold and try again. But since everybody's starting here, I'm going to give you a couple of tips for Gladius, which is everybody's first boss. First and foremost, the most important thing is a holy damage weapon. As stated earlier, this will give you more damage and better stagger opportunities, which will give you a unique sound effect when you know that you've triggered them. But for Gladius specifically, if you're playing this solo, a couple of interesting things to note is that despite this move where he will split into 3 different dogs, typically they will only target you one at a time. So you can kind of focus the one that is being aggro on you at that moment and just work on avoiding them. Eventually you will need to deal with all of them, but for the most point, you can kind of just run away from these and pick your opportunities to punish when they come. But don't worry about fighting all 3 at once. In co-op, they're all a little bit more aggressive, but in solo, you pretty much only need to think about dealing with enemies one at a time. That's not just for the main boss, that's for the entire game as well. Another thing is that getting under Gladius and kind of behind them is the best and safest way to be. Now, obviously, he'll be moving around a lot, so that's not always possible, but you can get some pretty reliable punishes if you're kind of off to the left or right side and mostly behind them. It might take you a couple of tries, but honestly, I recommend going into co-op just to play against the boss and try to learn it before you take it on solo. If you're confident that you can beat it, then go right ahead, but the bosses are definitely, they require a bit of learning because they will have moves that will surprise you and things that will come out of nowhere that you'll need to know about and you probably just won't get from a first time around. But either way, people shouldn't have that hard of a time beating Gladius after a couple of tries, but whether you win or lose, you're going to get relics and your character will get stronger and you'll have more options to customize yourself before going after another run. And also, not to mention, after you defeat more Night Lords and beat some bosses, you're going to get more story moments to do character quests. That's a whole other thing on its own, but that's essentially how to get some of the best relics for your character. But for now, just worry about defeating bosses. I just wanted to make a very simple to follow beginner's guide for this game, and I'm going to have many more videos in the future with much more advanced tips for players who are more experienced and who really want to sink their teeth into this game and get a lot better. So be on the lookout for those. Make sure to subscribe for those videos coming soon. Either way, I just want to say don't give up either. This game can be frustrating, but it's not impossible and you can do it. You will feel very satisfied when you actually overcome one of those Night Lords. So good luck to you. Enjoy Limveld, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace out.